Good day, grade 12 learners. Welcome to today's Life Sciences lesson. My name is Dito Magwala, and this program is brought to you by the Northern Cape Department of Education in collaboration with Pagama Research and Development. So in today's lesson, we are looking at our paper 2 revision lesson. So here we are going to be looking at the second part of our question paper. So we will be looking at section B, question 3. In the previous lesson, we looked at section B, question 2. So now we are going to look at the question 3 part, and we're just going to finish off that question paper that we were going through. Okay, so just a reminder of your paper 2 topics, just so you do not prepare for the wrong topics for your exam. We have DNA, Code of Life, which is 27 marks. We have meiosis, which is 21 marks. We also have genetics and inheritance for 48 marks. And lastly, we have evolution for 54 marks. All right. So by the end of our lesson today, you should be able to differentiate between natural and artificial selection. So you should understand the difference between these two. You should be able to describe punctuated equilibrium. You should also be able to describe speciation. And you should be able to describe Darwin's theory of natural selection. You should also be able to describe the significance of the differences in the cranium size between the humans and the apes, and you should also be able to analyze and answer questions on a phylogenetic tree. Now, when we have a look at this, these objectives, you would see that it is almost everything in evolution that has been asked here. So we have your natural selection question, we have punctuated equilibrium question, meaning that as you go through that, you should also be able to think about the other type of evolution. You should also be able to describe speciation, meaning that we are also looking at that. We are looking at Darwin's theory of natural selection, meaning that you can also think about Lamarckism as well, right? So with punctuated equilibrium, you should also be thinking about gradualism as well, right? And then the significance of the cranium sizes between humans and apes. You will be comparing the humans and the apes here. You can also just compare the differences that they have in all the differences. You should also be able to be looking at the similarities as you are looking at these differences. And lastly, your phylogenetic tree, whereby you will be just tracing the development or the changes that are happening as evolution takes place. Right. So for 3.1, here, which is our first question, it says tabulate 3 differences between artificial selection and natural selection. Now, our mark allocation, we have 7 marks. However, they want 3 differences. This means that for your table, it is going to be 1 mark. For simply just drawing this table like this, this is 1 mark, a mark that you should never ever lose. So whenever it says tabulate, make sure you draw that table, and it is actually a complete table, right? And then it means on one side you will write artificial selection, and on the other side you will write natural selection. So these should be clearly indicated, and then you will give those 3 differences, right? So remember, when you are looking at the differences here, if you are talking about the fact that this is to satisfy human needs, it means that here you are going to talk about nature, right? And then if here humans are the selection force, it means that here nature is the selection force. So it means that the things that you're going to be talking about here should actually align with each other. You cannot talk about nature selecting the desirable characteristic on the other side and then talking about human needs being fulfilled on the other side as the differences. Those are not differences. So let's have a look at those differences. So humans select a desired characteristic. So here it will be the humans that desire this, that select this desired characteristic, meaning that humans will identify a characteristic that they desire and then they will select it, right? And then whereas with natural selection, nature would be the one that selects this desirable characteristic and actually choose it. So that is the selective force in this case. And then with artificial selection, human needs are fulfilled. So humans select desirable characteristics in order to fulfill their needs, right? And then with natural selection, there the characteristic improves chances of survival. So if the characteristics are desirable, the chances of survival would also improve. And then next one, humans select the organisms to breed. So obviously, if you have identified certain organisms with these desirable characteristics, then you would select those specific organisms. Whereas in natural selection, we know that mating is random. We know that mating is random. Organisms can mate with any organism that they choose to mate with without there being a specific selection on which organisms can actually mate, right? And then the characteristics of the population do not necessarily change, right? Meaning that here only those characteristics of the organisms that have been selected are the only ones that are going to be affected. Whereas with natural selection, the characteristics of the population change. Remember when we talk about evolution by natural selection, right? We know that with the variation that is there as natural selection takes place, we are going to experience some changes with time, right? And then lastly, it may involve more than one species, whereas with natural selection, it occurs within a species. Why does it occur within a species in natural selection? It is because organisms of different species will not be able to interbreed. There will not be any gene flow between the organisms of different species, hence it can only take place within the same species when it comes to natural selection. So any of these 3 points would get you the 6 marks plus that 1 mark for drawing a table. Okay, let's have a look at 3.2. So we can see this diagram that represents a punctuated equilibrium. We can see that we have these long periods of time here where there are no changes, and then some changes within a short period of time there, right? It says here, use the letters A and B to explain the theory of punctuated equilibrium for 4 marks, right? So we know that when we talk about punctuated equilibrium, we are basically talking about evolution that involves a long periods of time whereby there is no changes or there are no changes, and that long period of time would then alternate with a short period of time whereby there are rapid changes, right? Or there are quick changes that are going to take place only for a very short period of time. So the long periods of time are seen at part A, and then the short periods of time with rapid changes are seen at part B. So this involves evolution, long periods of time where species do not change or change gradually through natural selection as shown by A, and then which will alternate with a punctuated by a short period of time where there is a rapid change that occurs through natural selection at part B. All right. So remember, when we look at punctuated equilibrium, we are looking at the short periods of time, no change. Long periods of time with no change, and short period of time with rapid changes, as opposed to gradualism, whereby changes are taking place slowly or gradually. Remember, with gradualism, you would then see that the changes that you come across are going to take place, and it's like they are taking place as you are looking at them, because you're going to see the gradual changes. For example, if you are looking at a color change of butterflies, you would see the colors changing slowly. You are going to see those in between colors, which we refer to as transitional organisms. Whereas with punctuated equilibrium, you do not see that. You see this organism and then it has suddenly changed to something else. And then there's long periods of time where it doesn't change, and then suddenly again it changes to something else. Whereas with gradualism, there are changes that are taking place slowly. Okay, and then with 3.3, it says an ancestral squirrel population living in an area was separated when an earthquake caused a deep valley to form. The two populations were separated from each other and no longer lived in the same area. Over thousands of years, the divided squirrel populations became two different species. Okay, now it says here, define the term population. So what are we talking about when we are talking about a population? Here we are talking about organisms that are able to interbreed, so they have to be of the same species. Remember, organisms cannot be of the same species if they are not able to interbreed with each other. So they must be of the same species. They must occupy the same habitat at the same time, which means that they should not occupy the same habitat, however, at different times of the year or at different times, basically. So same species, meaning that they must be able to interbreed. And then same habitat, meaning that they must be found in the same area at the same time. Right. Okay. And then 3.3.2, it says name 2 reproductive isolating mechanisms that help to keep species separate. So here we have mechanisms of reproductive isolation. We have 5 different mechanisms that we can look at there, right? We look at things like species specific courtship behavior. We look at infertile offspring, whereby the offspring of 2 closely related organisms that are not of the same species are able to mate, however they produce an offspring that is infertile, therefore that organism cannot reproduce, right? And then we have breeding time at different times of the year. As I've said, these organisms, they have to be of the same species in the same habitat at the same time. Now, if they are in the same habitat but they breed at different times of the year, it means that they will never be of the same species. Right. And then we have adaptation to different pollinators. So we may have pollinating agents, and we may have 2 organisms that are closely related, but because they have different pollinating agents, it means that this pollinating agent from organism A will not be able to take the pollen from that organism and deposit it into the organism B, as the pollinating agents are different, meaning that the pollinating agent of organism A will never land on organism B, right? As they are different. Therefore, these 2 organisms will never be able to have that interbreeding. Okay, and then we also have prevention of fertilization, whereby it specifically talks about sex organs. So the organisms here will have sex organs that are not compatible with each other, therefore mating will not be able to take place. Right. Okay. So those are our mechanisms of reproductive isolation. 3.3.3 says describe the speciation of the squirrels. So here we were told that these species were separated when an earthquake caused a deep valley. So already when you read this, you must be able to identify the geographical barrier, the type of barrier that separated this population into 2 subpopulations. So a deep valley can be an example of that geographical barrier, and this should be mentioned when you are answering your question, because it usually is a compulsory mark, meaning that if you do not mention that they were separated by a deep valley, it means that you are automatically going to be marked out of 5, as you will not be getting that 1 mark or mentioning the type of geographical barrier that is separating those organisms. All right. Okay. So here we are going to talk about variation. There is that variation here. No, we're not talking about variation here. We are going to talk about the fact that there is one group of species or population, right? And then these 2 are going to be separated into 2 subpopulations. Right. Now, when they are separated by these 2 subpopulations, there is no longer any gene flow between the 2 populations, as they are not able to reach each other due to the geographical barrier, right? Also, remember to mention that geographical barrier, the type of geographical barrier that you have, right? And then you also mentioned that as they are now separated from each other, it means that the environmental conditions that they are going to come across are going to be different, meaning that the organisms at this one side are going to experience natural selection independently from the organisms that are on the other side. Natural selection is taking place independently because their environmental conditions are different from each other. Right. And then as that happens, it will then mean that these organisms are now going to be phenotypically and genotypically different from each other. Right. So they are completely different from each other. Then that means that if these organisms or these species were to meet again at some point, if they were to mix again at some point, maybe if that geographical barrier is no longer there, they will not be able to interbreed as they are no longer of the same species. And that would then mean that a new species has been formed. Or you can say two separate species have been formed. Right. Okay, so this is how you would structure your question on evolution by natural selection. Make sure you mention that type of geographical barrier. Okay, 3.4, it says a population of frogs live in a pond. The frogs may be darker or lighter in color. A population of herons, so we have a population of frogs, we have a population of herons, which are the long-legged water birds who feed on the frogs, live in the same habitat. Over a period of time, the water in the pond became darker in color. So already when we are looking at the dark color of the water, we can see that it means that the frogs that are dark are going to be camouflaged in the dark water. They will not be clearly visible in the water. That already tells us that it means that the frogs that are dark colored are going to have an advantage as they will not be visible to the predators. This caused the frog population to change over a period of 4 years as shown in the diagram below. Let's have a look at the diagram. So we started off at year 1 with the lighter or the brighter frogs dominating, meaning that we had more white frogs than the black frogs in this pond situation. Right. And then in the second year, the dark ones started to increase, and we can see that here there's almost the same, there's actually the same amount of frogs here. There's 50-50 because the white ones are decreasing and the black ones are increasing. And then on year 3, the black ones have increased even more. And on year 4, we do not have the white ones anymore. It says here, use Darwin's theory of evolution to explain how the frog population changed over a period of 4 years. Right. Here, this is where we talk about variation. What do we mean when we say this variation? That is what we talk about. Here, we can see a great deal of variation. Why? We can see frogs that are dark. We can see frogs that are light or white. That is the variation. Right. Now, as we are seeing this, we would then know that it means that either being dark or being light is a desirable characteristic or a favorable characteristic, meaning that the organism that has the favorable characteristic, in this case, the black organism or the dark organism, is the one that is going to have the favorable characteristic, is going to survive. Right? Because the environment favors it to survive more by being able to camouflage in the dark water and therefore being difficult for the birds to see these frogs in the dark water. Right. So some of the frogs were light in color and some were dark in color. Those that were light were not camouflaged, whereas those that were dark were camouflaged and they were less visible to the predators. If they were less visible to the predators, it means that they survived, right? Now, because they survived and reproduced, it means that they passed on the allele for dark color to their offspring, meaning that now their offspring have received that allele for dark color. Okay, now because the offspring have received the allele for dark color, it means that they are then able to pass it on to the next generation and to the next generation until the population of dark-colored frogs has increased over that period of 4 years. Now, because the light ones do not have that favorable characteristic, it means that as time goes on, they are more and more visible to the predators. The predators will continue to feed on them until eventually we cannot see any of the white or of the light colored frogs because they were more visible to the predator as they are different from the water, and therefore they were fed on and that population decreased. So as one population increases, the other population would decrease. As the population with the favorable characteristics increase, the population with the unfavorable characteristics would then decrease. Now let's have a look at 3.5. It says here, the diagram below shows three skulls, skull A, skull B, and skull C. Now, by looking at these skulls, you should be able to know which one is older and which one is younger, right? How do you do that? You look at the characteristics. You look at things like the brow ridges. You look at things like the jaw, the size of the cranium as well. So as you are looking at these, remember, for you to look at this, you should have that knowledge of what should happen to the brow ridges, what should happen to the jaw, the size of the skull, and all of that. So by knowing all of that, you are then able to have a look at these three skulls and be able to say, okay, skull A is older, skull B is the second youngest, and skull C is the youngest, if that is the case. So just get that knowledge first before you can even try to differentiate or arrange these skulls by age. So that is actually what is asked in question 3.5.1. It says arrange the skulls A, B, C from oldest to youngest or most recent. Now it means that you must say this one is the oldest, this one is the middle one, and that other one is the youngest. So do not make it vice versa. Right, now let's have a look at them. So which one is the oldest? The oldest here would be B, and then the second one would be C, and then the third one would be A. So it means that your answer would be B, C, A, and that is the order in which there's the oldest and the youngest, right? So that is BCA. 3.5.2. It says here, describe the significance of the difference in cranium size between skull A and skull C. So between the youngest and the oldest, basically, right? No, between the second two, actually, this one and this one. So why is it important that they have these differences in the size of the skull, right? So we know that if the skull is big, or it then means that the cranium of that skull is going to be bigger as well, or larger. The cranium is going to be larger than that of C, right? And the larger the cranium, it indicates that the larger the brain. Now remember, when you talk about increased brain size, we are then going to start talking about increased intelligence, right? It means that as evolution took place and these modern species evolved, it then meant that they were more intelligent. It meant that they had now an increased brain capacity. They were able to do things better than the previous ones. The skull at A was able to, the organisms of skull at A were able to do things better than the organisms of skull C, basically, right? Or you can say that the cranium of C is smaller than the cranium of A, and that indicates that there is a reduced brain capacity or reduced intelligence, meaning that these ones do not have the same amount of intelligence as those at A. Right, 3.5.3. Describe two visible differences in the structure of the jaw of skulls A and B. Now, skull A and B, it means that it's the young one and the old one. So because it's A and B, right? Now, what kind of visible differences are you seeing there? Another thing that I like here is that it did not mention that you must tabulate, meaning that you can just describe them in the form of a description and you will still get all of your marks. Now, if we look at A and C, is it A and C or is A and B, the youngest one and the oldest one? You will see that here, this one is more prognathous, as we can see here, and this one is less prognathous, right? And then we can also see that the brow ridges are of different sizes. We can see that skull B has those protruding brow ridges or pronounced brow ridges, whereas skull A does not have that. And then we can also see that there is that sloping on the forehead of skull B, whereas that sloping is not seen on the skull on the forehead of skull A, right? So the skull A is less prognathous, less protruding jaw. So the jaw is less protruding there, right? And then once you start talking about how protruding the jaw is, you must then also start talking about the chin. So if you have a look, you would see that at A, we do have a well defined chin, whereas at B, we do not have that well defined chin. So A has a well defined chin, whereas B does not have that chin. Okay. And then lastly, skull A has a smaller jaw. So the jaw is also a bit smaller, whereas skull B has a larger jaw. And then you can also mention the brow ridges, as I have said. You can mention that they are more prognathous, whilst the brow at B they are more protruding, whereas at A the brow ridges are not that visible. Right. Okay, let's have a look at 3.6. 3.6, it says the picture shows the parts of the skeletal structures of two hominids, right? A, we can see that this is a bipedal organism, and then B, we can see that we are looking at a quadrupedal organism. 3.6.1, it says name the term used to describe the type of locomotion of species B. So at species B, we are looking at quadrupedalism or quadrupedal organism, right? So that is what we see at C. Right, and then 3.6.2, it says explain how the position of the foramen magnum, the shape of the spine, and the structure of the pelvis are suited for the type of locomotion at A. Right, at A, we are seeing that we have that bipedal organism, right? Now, how does the foramen magnum play a role in this? Right, so remember, the foramen magnum is located in a more forward position here. So it is in a more forward position. Because it is in a more forward position, it means that it allows the spine to enter the head from underneath, basically. When that happens, it means that it allows for this organism to stand upright and be able to face ahead. So it basically allows for bipedalism here, because then this organism is standing upright and it has the whole body to support the whole lower body to support the upper body. Right. So that is how the position of the foramen magnum suits locomotion. Right. And then with the shape of the spine, you would see that these organisms are showing that the spines are different in shape, right? Here you would see that this one has a more S-shaped spine, whereas this one has a more C-shaped spine. So that is what makes these spines a bit different from each other, right? So the foramen magnum is in a forward position and it allows the spinal cord to enter vertically, right? And then the spine here is S-shaped, whereas the spine of the other organism is C-shaped. So that allows for the absorption and flexible movement as well as support, right? And then the pelvis, the next one said how the pelvis is suited. So here we have a pelvis that is going to be short and wide. Now, when we have a pelvis that is short and wide, it means that we are going to have a big enough pelvis to carry the weight of the upper body, right? So now that allows for better locomotion, or that allows for better bipedalism because of the shape of the pelvic girdle. So if the pelvic girdle is short and wide, it means that it is able to accommodate the whole weight of the upper body, unlike with what we are seeing at B, whereby we are looking at quadrupedalism. Now, another thing, when you look at parts where they are talking about parts of an organism being structurally suited or being suited for their function. When you talk about the type of locomotion, we're basically talking about a function that this organism has to carry out, right? Anything that talks about suitability, you mention the structure and you mention how that structure allows the organism to perform a certain function. For example, we spoke about the short and wide pelvic girdle. That short and wide pelvic girdle is able to carry the upper body to make sure that this organism is now standing upright on two limbs and is able to move around. Whereas when we're talking about quadrupedalism instead of bipedalism, we will then start talking about this organism being able to move around, however, not being able to move around as best as when we are looking at bipedalism. So there you talk about the shape or the structure and how it allows it for the organism to perform its functions. Now 3.6.3 says name two species that display the type of locomotion shown by species A. So organisms that are bipedal, basically. So you should also know this. You should also know that the Homo sapiens are bipedal. You should know that the Homo habilis are bipedal as well. You should know that the Homo erectus, Homo naledi, as well as the Australopithecus organisms or species are also bipedal, right? As we are talking about bipedalism in the previous question. Now, when you look at that, these are things that you should generally just be able to remember. So as you are looking at things like the phylogenetic tree, just go through that and understand when certain events took place as the certain organisms evolved, right? So you should be able to understand that as well. Okay, now 3.7, the phylogenetic tree. The phylogenetic tree shows the evolutionary relationship between some species. Okay, please make sure that you bring a ruler into your examination before you can attempt to answer this question. Make sure you bring actually all your mathematical instruments so that you are able to answer any question, because you might be able to draw a pie chart. You should be able to then draw that pie chart. Right. Okay, so we have our time on top in million years, and we also have present day. Right. And then we have the modern humans, which started existing about 4 million years ago until present day. We have the chimpanzees, which also started, actually here. It starts here, the common ancestor is here, and then they branch here. Both the humans and the chimpanzees, they branch at the same time about 4 million years ago. Right. And then at B, we have the branching here to the gorillas, which tells us then that the modern humans are more closely related to the chimpanzees than the gorillas, because the gorillas are branching from something different from those two. And then lastly, the A, at A here, we are shown the branching into B, and we are also shown the branching of the gorillas as well as the orangutans. Okay, now let's have a look at our first question there, 3.7.1. It says, give the letter of the most recent common ancestor of all the species in the diagram. Okay, now let's have a look at that. The most recent ancestor, it would be A, because as we can see here, B is not the common ancestor of all the organisms, because it is not the common ancestor for the orangutans, so it is not a common ancestor for all the species. However, A would be the correct one there. 3.7.2. It says, when did chimpanzees and modern humans diverge or separate? When we're talking about diverging is when they are separating from the common ancestor C. Right, it means that they were both from the common ancestor, however, they diverged, meaning that they separated at a specific time, and that is about 4 million years ago. So if we are moving that way, it means here we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes, then that means that it would be 6 million years ago instead of 4 million years ago. Remember, we are counting from 0 upwards. So just before 5, from 10 going downwards, it would then be 6 million years ago instead of 4 million years ago. Okay, and then 3.7.3 says state 3 characteristics of the upper limb that humans share with other primates. So characteristics that we share with other primates, specifically on the upper limb, meaning that you should not talk about the lower limbs, you should not talk about the mammary glands and all of that, only on the upper limbs. So there you can mention the fact that we both have bare nails instead of claws. We both have that opposable thumb that is facing a different direction from all the other fingers. You can mention that we all have five fingers as well, right? And then we also have that freely rotating arm. And the last one there, also the upper arms are actually long, and there is that rotation around the elbow joints. So freely rotating arms, long arms, rotation around the elbow, bare fingertips instead of claws, and that opposable thumb. And also you can mention that there is, we all have the 5 fingers. All right. Okay, let's have a look at the homework. It says here, this is genetics and inheritance. It says here, in sheep, the allele for black wool is dominant over the allele for white wool. Already you can see with the letters. Remember, use the letters to guide you there, right? And the allele for horns is dominant over the allele for being hornless. Now we're talking about wool color, and we are talking about having horns or not having horns. This tells us that we are looking at a dihybrid cross. Now remember, you will not be asked to draw a dihybrid cross in the examination. You will only be expected to answer questions about this dihybrid cross and sort of fill in some spaces that are missing in order to just complete that cross. You will not be able to draw it. You will not be asked to draw it. However, you should be able to understand how it is drawn so that you can be able to answer the questions that are asked around it. Okay, it then says a black wooled sheep with horns is crossed with a white wooled sheep without horns. So here we have white wools. It means that once you get this, ask yourself, what is the genotype? You've been given the phenotype. What is the genotype? Also break it down. Break it down here. It can be this. It can be that. Right? Let's use a different color to just separate these two so that you can be able to see that you are now dealing with 2 different organisms there. I mean, 2 different characteristics. So here we have the black wool, and then we have the white wool over there. Now, if we have a look at these 2 characteristics, you can see that with the first organism, there's the wool, and then there's also the horns, and then with the second one again, the wool and not having horns. Now, black wool. What is it that we know about black wool? We know that black wool is dominant. Now, they say this organism is black wooled. It means that it will be BB there. And then with horns. Is having horns dominant? Yes, having horns is dominant, meaning that we are going to have that there. And then here, white wool is recessive, though, so we know that this is what is happening. Here it can also be heterozygous. And then being hornless is also recessive, meaning that we are going to have that. The Punnett diagram below shows the possible gametes produced by each parent. Now they've already shown you the gametes that are produced by each parent, which is what we have here. So sheep 1 would have that, sheep 2 would have this. Because sheep 2 is recessive, we can see that all of the gametes that are produced, they are recessive, whereas here, from this genotypes that we have, you can then determine the gametes. right? And we can see that here from this parent, we have capital letter B and small letter b, and we have capital letter H and small letter h, which then tells us that both these characteristics are heterozygous, meaning that the black wool is capital B small b and the horns is capital H small h. Remember, you're going to cross these with each other to get those gametes, right? And then there we have them here. You are given, it means that you use this to complete this table over here, meaning that you're going to fill this in, and the X and the Y will probably be part of the questions that you are asked. They are asking for the genotype and the phenotype, meaning that from your knowledge of the genotype, you will answer the question on the phenotype, right? And then also they say give the genotype of the black-wooled sheep with horns, that is sheep 1. Based on the gametes that you are given, you should be able to identify them. You should be able to identify the genotype. We've been given the phenotype already, right? Okay. Now go through that and answer those questions. And then the next part says, give the proportion of the offspring. Remember, when you are asked about proportion, you should then be able to give your answers in the form of a proportion. And when it says percentage, you should also be able to give your answers in the form of a percentage. Remember also, these type of questions, 1.5.4 and 1.5.5, can be asked in a normal monohybrid cross at the end, whereby you are supposed to do your calculations once you are done with the cross. And those are usually compulsory marks that you need to be able to give in order to score your full 6 marks. So they are the answers. Go through the questions and come back with the answers for the next lesson. Now, just to wrap up what we discussed today, differences. When the question says tabulate, give in a table form so that you can get a mark for the table. And then punctuated equilibrium is the evolution that involves long periods of time with no changes, which alternates with short periods of time with rapid change. That does not change, right? Unless you are given a scenario whereby you should describe what has happened. Other than that, that is simply how you talk about punctuated equilibrium. And as I've said, you should be able to differentiate punctuated equilibrium with gradualism. Okay. And then when you are describing speciation, you should give the specific geographical barrier, right? You should be able to give that so that you can get that compulsory mark as well, and also explain how evolution takes place independently between the two populations and how they will then be unable to interbreed should they mix again, because they would have changed over the years, right? And the fact that there is no gene flow between those two. And then Darwin's theory of natural selection, or evolution by natural selection, explains that organisms of the same species show genetic variation. So there is a great deal of genetic variation, which then means that some organisms would contain the favorable characteristics and others will not have those favorable characteristics. Do not forget to mention that those with the favorable characteristics would survive and those without the favorable characteristics will not survive. Those that are surviving will reproduce and the characteristics will be passed on from one generation to the next, right? You can also mention what type of favorable characteristic it is, right? Okay. Now, in our next lesson, we are going to look at our prelim paper 1 exam preparation revision. So here we will be just looking at tips on how to get the best marks for our exam for paper 1 specifically. We're going to look at all the topics that are part of paper 1, right? So we are going to make sure that we look at the main points that we can get there, how to answer certain questions, things to look out for when you are answering all those questions, just so we can be able to get as many marks as possible. Okay, we have come to the end of our lesson for today. Thank you for watching. I will see you next time. Goodbye.